It was a hot, bright afternoon on Boulder Highway. The sun was shining hard, and the air shimmered with heat. Cars moved along the busy road, some honking at each other, some rushing to their destinations, and most people were completely focused on where they were going. The sound of tires on asphalt and the hum of engines filled the air. It was the kind of afternoon that made people think about getting somewhere quickly and avoiding trouble. But then, something unusual caught the attention of one driver. A small figure was standing near the edge of the road. At first, it looked like just another person walking, maybe a pedestrian or someone waiting for a bus. But as the driver got closer, it became clear that this was no ordinary pedestrian. It was a toddler, alone, standing near the shoulder of the busy highway. The child looked tiny, lost and unsure of where to go. His little legs were unsteady, and he shifted from one foot to the other, glancing around as if looking for someone familiar. The cars were passing so close that the child seemed almost invisible to everyone else. People were focused on their own lives, not noticing the danger right in front of them. But the driver could see it clearly, and something inside him immediately felt alarmed. He slowed down the car, careful not to startle the child, and kept his eyes fixed on him. The boy's hair was messy from the heat, and his clothes were wrinkled like he had been wandering for a while. He had a small backpack that was slipping off one shoulder. The sight of him, so tiny and alone on a busy road, made the driver's heart tighten. He knew that every second counted. One wrong step, and it could end in disaster. The driver pulled over safely to the side, leaving enough space so other cars could pass. Then he got out of the car. As he approached, he kept his hands visible, showing the child that he meant no harm. He spoke softly in a calm and gentle voice. "Hey there, little guy. Are you okay? Where's your mommy or daddy?" The child looked up at him, eyes wide and unsure. He didn't answer at first, just stared. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the hum of passing cars. The man could see fear and confusion in the child's eyes, and it made him kneel down to the toddler's level. He wanted to make sure the child didn't feel intimidated or scared. "Hey, it's okay. I'm here to help you," he said. His voice was kind, steady, and gentle, like a warm blanket on a cold day. He held out his hand slowly, giving the child a chance to come closer if he wanted. The little boy took a hesitant step forward, then another. His small hand touched the man's, gripping it lightly but firmly. A few people had started to notice. Some slowed down, curious about what was happening. Others pulled out their phones, ready to call for help if needed. The man didn't care about attention. He only cared about keeping the child safe. He stayed where he was, shielding the boy from the road as best he could. Making sure no car got too close, the child finally started to speak, though his words were shaky and barely audible. I lost," he said, his little voice trembling. The man nodded, understanding immediately. "You're lost, huh? That's okay. We're going to fix this. We'll find your family, don't worry." Time seemed to stretch. Every passing car felt louder than the last, but the man stayed calm, knowing that panicking would only make the child more scared. He spoke to him in soft tones, asking small questions to keep the boy talking, to keep his mind off the fear. "Do you remember where you were before you got here? Can you tell me about your house? Or your toys?" The toddler tried to answer, pointing in random directions and mumbling words that didn't make much sense. But that didn't matter. The man kept encouraging him, telling him that it was okay, that he was safe now. He crouched down, keeping his body between the child and the road. A protective barrier. Minutes passed, and it felt like hours. The toddler's fear began to lessen slightly. He started to relax a little, trusting the man holding his hand. He clung to the man's fingers, tiny hands gripping tightly, like a lifeline. Every few seconds he looked at the cars zooming past, eyes wide, but the man whispered reassurance. "We're going to be okay. I won't let anything happen to you." A few more bystanders had gathered now, curious but careful. One woman slowly stepped forward, offering a bottle of water. The man thanked her, giving the child a sip. The simple act of drinking seemed to help him feel safer, more grounded. He still didn't understand fully what was happening, but he could feel that someone was on his side, Then the man started looking around, scanning the area for clues. He noticed a nearby apartment complex a short distance away. He wondered if the child had wandered from there. The gates looked old and slightly open, and he thought it might be possible that the boy had wandered out while no one was watching. He kept talking to the child, while keeping an eye out for anyone who might be the parent. "Hey, we're going to figure this out together," he said. "You're not alone anymore." The toddler clung to his hand tighter, as if understanding, even in his small way, that help had arrived. It was a moment that could have ended badly in an instant. Just a few more steps in the wrong direction, and it could have been a disaster. But the man stayed calm, patient, and focused. He didn't rush, didn't panic, and didn't try to do everything at once. He simply stayed with the child, offering safety, comfort, and attention. Other drivers had slowed down, some stopping entirely to watch from a safe distance. A few shouted suggestions or offered to help. The man nodded politely, keeping control of the situation without creating chaos. He knew the most important thing was the child's safety. Everything else came second. Finally, as the minutes ticked by, he saw a police car in the distance, responding to calls from concerned witnesses. Relief washed over him. Help was coming, but until then, he would stay with the child. He crouched lower, keeping the toddler close, whispering soothing words. "You're doing great. We're almost there. Just a little longer." By now, the boy was calmer. His little feet shuffled nervously, but he no longer looked as scared. He had someone he trusted, someone who would not let him fall or get hurt. And for the man, seeing that small bit of relief on the child's face was worth every second of worry and tension. It was just a normal afternoon on Boulder Highway for most people. But for that small toddler, and for the man who stopped to help, it was a moment that mattered more than anything. A moment where a life could have been in danger, and yet, thanks to calmness, patience, and care, a disaster had been avoided. And though no one realized it yet, the story was only beginning. This small act of kindness, this careful attention to a frightened little child, was about to lead to a moment that no one would ever forget. The police car arrived a few minutes later, its lights flashing softly, reflecting off the asphalt. The sound of the siren had faded as it pulled up carefully, and the officers stepped out, quickly assessing the situation. The toddler was still, holding the man's hand, standing close as if he would never let go. The boy's little chest heaved with nervous energy, but the presence of the police, along with the gentle comfort of the man who had stopped for him, seemed to make the moment feel safer. One officer knelt down to the child's level, just like the man had been doing. "Hey there, buddy," the officer said gently. "You're safe now, okay? We're here to help." The toddler looked at him with wide eyes, unsure whether to trust this new voice. The man squeezed the child's hand lightly, giving a subtle reassurance that it was all right. The officers quickly set up a small safe area by the side of the road. One of them directed traffic to move carefully, while the other got a bottle of water and a blanket to keep the child comfortable. The sun was hot, and the asphalt radiated heat, so small gestures like shade and water made a big difference. The toddler sat down slowly, still holding the man's hand, letting the officer cover his little shoulders with the blanket. He didn't speak much, just nodded slightly. Taking in the strange new environment, the man stayed close, never letting go of the child's hand. He crouched down next to him, speaking softly in the same calm, soothing tone he had been using since finding the toddler. "We're going to find your family soon," he said. "It's just a little longer. They're looking for you right now." A few more bystanders had gathered now, keeping a safe distance but watching the scene unfold. Some whispered to each other, pointing quietly at the man and the child. He noticed the attention but didn't react. He knew the moment wasn't about recognition or praise. It was about making sure the little boy stayed calm, felt safe, and was protected until the parents could arrive. The toddler's lips trembled slightly, and he looked down at his small shoes. The heat and excitement of the past minutes seemed to weigh on him. The man leaned a little closer. "It's okay to be scared," he said softly. "I know this is confusing, but you're not alone anymore. I won't let anything happen to you." The boy blinked up at him and gave a small nod, a tiny sign that he was starting to trust this stranger. The officers began asking gentle questions, trying to piece together where the child might have come from. They asked the toddler to point toward his home or any familiar place he remembered. The boy hesitated, then pointed in the direction of the apartment complex a few hundred feet away. The man nodded encouragingly. "Good job, that's a start. We're going to figure this out together." Meanwhile, the officer on the radio contacted dispatch, explaining that a small child had been found alone on the highway. Within minutes, additional units were dispatched to check nearby buildings and apartment complexes. A team of officers began canvassing the area, looking for anyone who might know the child. The man watched quietly, still holding the toddler's hand. Keeping him close to prevent him from wandering again, the child finally started to speak a few words. I play playground," he said, his voice small and uncertain. The man smiled softly. "Ah, you like the playground. That's nice. We'll find your family and maybe you can go play soon. But first, let's make sure you're safe." "Okay." The boy nodded again, a little more confidently this time, and leaned slightly against the man, as if drawing strength from his calm presence. Time passed slowly. Every minute seemed to stretch longer than usual. The heat of the day, the bright sunlight, and the hum of traffic created a tense atmosphere, but the man stayed focused, patient, and steady. He didn't rush the child or pressure him for answers. Instead, he offered comfort, safety, and reassurance. Knowing that these were the most important things in that moment, nearby, one of the bystanders, a woman who had been watching quietly, stepped forward. "Can I help?" she asked softly. The man nodded, grateful for the offer. She handed the toddler a small snack, which he accepted cautiously. Still keeping his little hand firmly in the man's, the simple act of eating something gave the child another moment of stability, a reminder that he was safe and cared for. As the search continued, the man noticed small details around the area. The gates to the nearby apartment complex were slightly open, just enough for a small child to slip through. He wondered if the toddler had wandered out unnoticed. He shared this with the officers, pointing toward the opening and describing what he had seen. The officers nodded and began to check the complex carefully. Making sure every child was accounted for, the toddler began to ask small questions. "Mommy? Daddy?" His voice was filled with worry, and the man crouched down closer. "They're looking for you right now," he said gently. "They'll be here soon. You're doing so well waiting with me." The boy's eyes flickered between the man and the surrounding officers, slowly realizing that he was no longer alone. A few more moments passed, and then a familiar voice called out from a distance. "Sweetie, where are you?" The toddler's face lit up with recognition. He wiggled in the man's grip and tried to run a few steps toward the sound. The man let go but stayed nearby, ensuring he didn't run into the street. The parents came into view, running quickly but carefully toward their child. Their faces were filled with relief, disbelief, and gratitude. The toddler ran into their arms, crying, laughing, and shouting at the same time. The man stepped back, giving them space, letting them have the moment they had been desperately hoping for. The parents thanked the man repeatedly, their voices trembling with emotion. "We don't know how to thank you enough," they said. "You kept him safe, you saved him." The man waved it off gently. "I just did what anyone would do. I'm glad he's safe now." He smiled, but inside he felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had made a real difference in someone's life. Even after the child was safely back with his parents, the man stayed for a little while, making sure everything was calm. The officers were finishing up their reports, talking quietly with the family, and the crowd of bystanders began to disperse. The man quietly slipped away, unnoticed by most, leaving only the memory of his calm, patient presence. What had started as a hot afternoon on a busy highway had turned into a moment of human connection, care, and kindness. A small child had been alone, scared, and in danger, but thanks to the steady actions of one person, disaster had been avoided. And while the world might not have known his name, for that child and his family, he would forever be remembered as the person who stopped, paid attention, and made sure everything was okay. The moment on Boulder Highway reminded everyone present of something important. Sometimes, the smallest actions, the quietest gestures, and the calmest voices can change the course of a life. The toddler had been lost, confused, and frightened. But through the patient intervention of one man, he was safe, and his story could continue. The afternoon would pass, cars would continue down the highway, and people would return to their routines, but for a brief, shining moment, kindness had been the strongest force on the road. After the toddler was safely with the man and the police had arrived, the search for answers began. The child had been found alone on the side of a busy highway, and everyone wanted to know how this had happened. The officers spoke quietly with the man who had stopped, asking him to describe exactly where he had seen the child, what he had done, and how the toddler had reacted. The man explained everything in detail, from the moment he noticed the little figure near the road to the careful steps he had taken to keep him safe. Meanwhile, the toddler sat on the curb, still holding the man's hand loosely, listening to the conversations around him. He was calmer now, but still a little confused. His small mind tried to process everything: the cars, the officers, the flashing lights, and the voices all around him. Every so often he glanced up at the man who crouched next to him, offering reassurance with a soft smile. "You're doing great," he said. "We're going to find your family soon, and everything will be okay." The officers began checking the nearby area. They looked around the highway, scanning for anything unusual. Then they turned toward the apartment complex a short distance away. One of the officers noticed the gate to the complex was slightly open. It wasn't broken, but it wasn't fully secured either. The man pointed it out, explaining that the child might have wandered out through that gate. The officers nodded and started moving carefully through the complex, checking each building and speaking with neighbors inside the apartment complex. People were startled to see uniformed officers moving through their community. Some came out to see what was happening. When the officers asked if anyone had seen a lost child, a few residents mentioned seeing a small boy wandering earlier in the day. One neighbor recalled seeing the toddler playing near the gate while his caregiver was distracted. It was a small detail, but it helped the officers piece together the story. The man stayed with the toddler, keeping him shaded from the sun and making sure he stayed hydrated. The child was quiet now, watching the officers walk through the complex. He asked a few questions. "Mommy, Daddy, are they coming?" The man smiled gently and nodded. "Yes, they're on their way. We're making sure they find you safely." His calm words seemed to bring comfort to the little boy, who leaned slightly against him as the officers continued their search. A few neighbors began talking quietly among themselves. They praised the man who had stopped for the child. "He saved him," one woman said. "If he hadn't been here, who knows what could have happened." The man stayed humble, focusing only on the child. He offered a quiet smile and simply replied, "I'm glad he's safe now." The toddler began to interact more. He asked for a small toy from his backpack, and the man helped him retrieve it. Holding the toy brought a small sense of normalcy, a connection to his familiar world amidst all the chaos. The little boy played quietly while the officers moved through the buildings, asking questions and checking rooms to ensure no other children were missing. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours for the child. He was beginning to tire from the sun and the excitement. The man noticed the small size of exhaustion and gently offered, "Would you like to sit down for a moment? We can wait here until your family is found." The boy nodded and settled down next to the man, who made sure the child was comfortable and safe. Finally, one officer returned from a nearby building, speaking quickly into his radio. The man's attention immediately went to the officer. The officer explained that they had located the toddler's caregiver, who had been frantically searching for him. She had been looking everywhere, calling his name, checking nearby streets, and even asking neighbors if they had seen him. The man's eyes met the toddler's, and he smiled. "See, they're coming. You're going to be with them soon." The little boy's eyes lit up with recognition, and he began to wiggle excitedly. "Mommy!" he shouted softly, though he still clung to the man's hand. The man crouched down, speaking gently. "It's okay. You're safe. They're almost here." The child's energy shifted from nervous tension to hopeful anticipation. When the caregiver finally arrived, her face was full of relief and gratitude. She ran toward the toddler, dropping to her knees and wrapping him in her arms. The child clung tightly to her, burying his small face into her chest. Tears of relief streamed down her face as she whispered words of comfort and apology. The man stayed back slightly, letting the emotional reunion take place. He watched quietly. Feeling satisfied that his role in the story had helped this family, the officers quickly ensured that everything was okay. They spoke briefly with the caregiver, confirming that the child was unharmed and explaining the importance of keeping a closer watch in the future. The man offered a few suggestions as well, gently pointing out the open gate and the need for extra supervision. The caregiver nodded, taking the advice seriously and promising to make changes. Immediately, even after the child was safely back with his caregiver, the man stayed nearby for a little while, making sure that everything was calm. He answered questions from the officers, giving a clear account of his actions and observations. People in the area continued to watch, murmuring among themselves about how calmly and effectively he had handled the situation. His presence had been the stabilizing factor that kept the toddler safe until the authorities arrived. The toddler's mood gradually shifted from fear to curiosity. He looked around at the officers, the man, and the surrounding buildings. The world that had seemed so dangerous and overwhelming a short while ago was beginning to feel safe again. He clutched a small toy in one hand and held onto the caregiver with the other. The man smiled, feeling the satisfaction of knowing that the child was now truly safe. Neighbors who had watched the events unfold began to offer words of praise and gratitude. "He was amazing," one woman said softly. "He didn't panic, and he kept the child safe." The man simply nodded, emphasizing that anyone in the same situation would have done the same. His focus had never been on recognition, it had been on making sure the child was unharmed. As the sun began to lower slightly in the sky, the scene slowly returned to normal. Cars continued to pass by, and life on the busy highway went on as usual. But for those who had witnessed the rescue, it was clear that something extraordinary had happened. A small act of kindness, calmness, and attention had made the difference between danger and safety. The toddler's caregiver thanked the man one last time, tears still in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you enough," she said. "You kept him safe when no one else noticed." The man smiled gently. "I just did what anyone would do. I'm glad he's safe now." With that, the man quietly turned and walked back toward his car, his job done. The officers finished their paperwork and made sure the child was safely returned to the caregiver. The toddler clutched his small toy tightly, feeling comforted by the familiar presence of his caregiver and the knowledge that he had been protected when it mattered most. The events of that day on Boulder Highway would stay with everyone involved for a long time. The child had been lost and frightened, but he had been found and protected. The man's calm actions had made all the difference. And for those who had witnessed it, it was a reminder that a single person's attention, care, and presence can truly change the outcome of a situation. It had been a day of fear, worry, and uncertainty. But it ended with relief, gratitude, and a quiet sense of hope. The toddler was safe, the caregiver was reassured, and the man who had intervened could leave knowing that he had made a real, meaningful impact on someone's life. In a world that often feels rushed and distracted, that quiet, patient act of human kindness stood out as something rare and important, a reminder that looking out for one another, even in small ways, can truly save lives. The air was filled with a mix of relief, tension, and a quiet excitement. The toddler's caregiver had finally arrived, running toward her child with a mixture of panic and hope. The boy's small legs carried him as quickly as he could toward her, though the man who had stayed with him made sure he didn't dart into the busy road. Every step was careful, measured, and full of emotion. The moment had been building for what felt like hours, and now the reunion was finally happening. The toddler's eyes widened when he saw the familiar face. Recognition brought an immediate response. He called out softly, "Mommy!" and wiggled in the man's gentle hold, ready to be free of the tension and fear that had gripped him for so long. The man smiled, crouching slightly so the boy could reach her safely. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe now. You're going to be with her." The caregiver dropped to her knees, opening her arms wide. The child ran into her embrace without hesitation, wrapping his small arms tightly around her neck. Tears streamed down her face, and the toddler, though still overwhelmed, pressed close to her, feeling the comfort of a familiar, loving presence. It was a reunion that carried the weight of fear and relief. A moment where words were not needed to express the depth of emotion. Nearby, the officers watched quietly, ensuring that the reunion stayed safe and calm. They smiled at the scene, recognizing the power of human connection in moments like this. The man who had found the child stepped back slightly, letting the family have their moment without distraction. His presence had been vital up until now, but he understood that the family needed privacy to process the relief and the emotions flooding through them. The caregiver whispered to her child softly, calming him as he still clung to her. "It's okay now, sweetheart. You're safe. I'm here." The boy's small hands tightened around her, and though his eyes were still wide with lingering fear, a sense of trust and safety began to return. He had been lost, uncertain and frightened, but in her arms, he was home. After a few moments, the caregiver's eyes met the man's, and she spoke, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to thank you. You kept him safe? I can't believe he's okay." The man smiled gently. "I'm just glad he's safe. That's all that matters." There was no need for applause, no need for recognition. In that quiet moment, gratitude was shared through eyes and gestures rather than words. The officers took a few moments to ensure that the child was unharmed physically. They checked for scratches, bumps, or signs of exhaustion. The boy had been through a lot, but he was remarkably resilient. He had clung to the man's calm presence and guidance, which had kept him steady through the overwhelming chaos. The officers confirmed that he was fine, though they recommended that the caregiver give him time, rest, and comfort after the ordeal. Neighbors who had been watching the scene unfold approached slowly, offering words of reassurance and support. "He's lucky to have you," one neighbor said to the caregiver, "and lucky that someone noticed him in time." The caregiver nodded, still holding her child close. She glanced at the man again, her eyes filled with appreciation. "He really helped us," she said. "I can't imagine what would have happened if he hadn't been there." The toddler, now calmer, began to explore his surroundings with the caregiver nearby. He held her hand, occasionally glancing at the man who had been his guardian for the past tense-filled minutes. The man crouched down to speak to him softly. "You were very brave," he said. "I'm proud of you for staying calm and waiting. That helped a lot." The boy smiled shyly, a small flicker of pride showing in his eyes. Even in such a short time he had experienced fear, uncertainty, and the comfort of trust. The caregiver sat down with her child on a nearby bench, making sure he was comfortable and reassured. She offered water and a snack, and the boy accepted quietly, taking small sips and bites while still holding onto his caregiver's hand. The man remained nearby, giving them space, but staying close enough in case they needed anything. He had been the anchor in the storm, and his calm presence had made all the difference. The officers spoke briefly with the caregiver, giving advice on how to prevent similar situations in the future. They suggested securing gates, keeping a closer watch on small children, and teaching them about safety near roads. She nodded attentively, taking their advice seriously. Knowing that a small change could prevent another frightening experience, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the highway and the apartment complex. The traffic noise seemed distant now, softened by the calm that had settled over the small gathering. People who had witnessed the events reflected quietly on what had just happened. A toddler had been alone in danger, and yet, through careful attention, calmness, and human kindness, disaster had been averted. The caregiver's voice broke the silence. "Can we do something to thank him?" she asked, looking at the man who had stepped in without hesitation. He shook his head gently. "Just seeing him safe is thanks enough," he said. "That's all I need." His humility was genuine, and it highlighted the simple truth that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't require recognition or reward. The toddler, now feeling safer, played quietly with his toy while sitting on his caregiver's lap. He occasionally glanced at the man and gave a small smile, a silent acknowledgment of the trust and guidance he had received. The man smiled back, satisfied that the child had transitioned from fear to comfort, from panic to safety. It was a quiet victory, but a significant one, a reminder that small acts of care can have profound effects. As the moments passed, the man finally decided it was time to leave. He stood up slowly, giving the child and caregiver one last smile. "Take care," he said softly. "Everything's going to be okay now." The caregiver nodded, still holding her child close. "Thank you," she said again, her voice filled with emotion. The boy waved shyly, and then, with the caregiver guiding him, they began to move toward their home, the sun casting a warm glow on their path. Even after the child was safely back with his family, the man's actions remained in the minds of everyone who had witnessed them. Bystanders continued to murmur quietly about how calmly he had handled the situation, how he had protected the child without panicking, and how his presence had made the difference between safety and danger. It was a quiet heroism, the kind that doesn't seek attention but leaves a lasting impact. The officers completed their reports and gave the caregiver a final set of instructions to ensure the child's safety in the future. They praised the man one last time for his intervention, though he simply smiled and walked away. His focus had never been on recognition. The child was safe, the caregiver was reassured, and the day's frightening events had been resolved without harm. That was enough. As the man drove away from Boulder Highway, the weight of the day's events settled on him quietly. He thought about the child, the caregiver, the officers, and the neighbors who had witnessed the calm and careful handling of a tense situation. It was a reminder that sometimes being observant, staying calm, and acting with care could change the outcome of someone's life. The toddler, now back in the safe arms of his caregiver, began to relax fully. He had experienced fear and uncertainty, but the presence of a calm and attentive stranger had guided him through the storm. He learned, in a small but meaningful way, that even in moments of danger, help could appear, and people could care deeply without expecting anything in return. As the sun continued to set, casting a golden light over Boulder Highway and the apartment complex, the day's events began to settle into memory. It had started as an ordinary afternoon, with cars moving quickly along a busy road. But in a quiet corner near the highway, a small child had been lost and found, frightened and reassured, alone and then held safely again. It was a day of fear and relief, of panic and calm, and ultimately, a day that highlighted the power of human kindness. And though the world around them would continue moving at its usual pace, the small family walking back home with their child would carry the memory of that day forever. The child would remember the gentle, calm presence of the man who had helped him, the officers who had arrived just in time, and the relief of being reunited with the caregiver. The man himself would continue his life quietly, knowing that he had made a real difference without needing recognition, applause, or reward. The emotional reunion on Boulder Highway reminded everyone present that sometimes small moments of attention, care, and patience could have a profound impact. It was a story not just about a lost child, but about the quiet heroism that exists in everyday life, the people who notice, who act, and who ensure that others are safe when it matters most. After the emotional reunion on Boulder Highway, the child was safely back with his caregiver, and the immediate danger had passed. Yet the story was far from over. The man who had stopped to help, though quietly stepping back, stayed nearby for a few more moments, ensuring that everything truly felt safe. He watched the child clinging to the caregiver, small hands gripping her tightly, a mix of relief and curiosity in his eyes. It was a quiet moment, but one that carried an invisible weight, the weight of safety restored. Fear soothed and trust rebuilt, the caregiver spoke softly to her child, whispering words of reassurance and comfort. "It's okay now, sweetheart. You're safe, and no one is going to let anything happen to you." The toddler, still overwhelmed but slowly calming, nodded and pressed his head against her shoulder. He clutched a small toy he had brought from home, a tiny anchor in a world that had suddenly seemed dangerous and unpredictable. The man, kneeling nearby, offered a gentle smile and spoke softly. You did very well. You stayed calm, and that helped a lot." Neighbors and bystanders who had witnessed the scene began to disperse, returning to their routines, yet they carried a sense of awe. They had seen a tense situation unfold, a small child in danger, and yet, thanks to the calm and careful actions of one man, disaster had been avoided. People whispered to one another about how quietly heroic the man had been. Not seeking attention, not asking for recognition, just stepping in because it was the right thing to do. The officers were finishing their paperwork, speaking briefly with the caregiver, giving advice on safety measures, and ensuring that the child was unharmed. They suggested securing gates, making sure small children were always supervised, and teaching the child about staying safe near busy roads. The caregiver listened carefully, grateful for their guidance and determined to take these precautions seriously. Her child, now calm and comforted, clung to her. Absorbing the reassurance of familiar voices and familiar arms, the man quietly approached the officers, offering additional information about what he had seen, the child's behavior, and the exact location where he had first noticed him. He explained calmly, without exaggeration, the steps he had taken to ensure the child's safety. The officers nodded, impressed by the clarity and level-headedness he had maintained under such tense circumstances. His presence had been the key to keeping the child safe, a stabilizing force in a moment of potential panic. The toddler, now sitting with his caregiver on a nearby bench, began to explore the surroundings slowly, testing the world to make sure it was truly safe. He held onto her hand, yet occasionally glanced at the man, as if to acknowledge the trust and guidance he had provided. The man smiled gently, watching the small gestures of recognition. It was a reminder that even small, quiet actions could leave a lasting impression on someone's life, especially a child's. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over Boulder Highway, the man finally decided it was time to leave. He stood, brushing his hands together, and gave a soft nod to the officers. "Take care," he said quietly. "Everything's going to be okay now." The caregiver looked up, tears still in her eyes, and spoke again. "Thank you. Truly, I don't know how we would have managed without you." The man smiled, shaking his head gently. "I'm just glad he's safe," he said. "That's all that matters." As he walked back toward his car, he reflected quietly on the events of the day. It had started as an ordinary afternoon on a busy highway, filled with the noise of traffic and the usual distractions of life. A small child had wandered into danger, and yet a calm presence, careful attention, and patient guidance had transformed a potentially tragic moment into one of safety and relief. The impact of such quiet heroism, he thought, was often invisible to the world but profoundly felt by those directly affected. Meanwhile, the child, now fully reassured by the caregiver's comforting presence, began to relax and play quietly. The small toy he had brought served as a link to his familiar world, helping him regain a sense of normalcy. He occasionally glanced at the man who had helped him, a flicker of recognition and gratitude in his small eyes. Even in such a short time he had experienced fear, uncertainty, and then relief and trust, a complete emotional journey. Guided by the calm actions of a kind stranger, the caregivers and officers began to discuss practical steps for the future. They talked about creating safer spaces, monitoring gates and entrances, and teaching children about safety in simple, understandable ways. Every suggestion was met with nods and promises to act. The child listened quietly, occasionally asking questions in his small voice, and the caregiver patiently answered, helping him understand the changes without overwhelming him. The bystanders, now gathered in small groups, whispered among themselves about the man who had stopped. "He didn't even ask for anything," one said. "He just made sure the child was safe." Another added, "It's rare to see someone act so calmly in such a tense moment. Most people would have panicked or called for help and stepped back. He stayed and made a difference." The man, overhearing a bit from a distance, felt a quiet satisfaction but did not dwell on it. Recognition had never been his goal. The child, sensing the calm and safety around him, finally allowed himself to smile. A few laughs escaped as he played with his toy and listened to the caregiver's soft reassurances. It was a small victory, but meaningful, a return to childhood innocence after an afternoon filled with fear and uncertainty. The man observed this quietly, knowing that his actions had contributed to this moment of relief and joy. As dusk approached, the man prepared to leave Boulder Highway entirely. The officers finished their paperwork, ensuring the caregiver had the contact information for any follow-up support. The child waved shyly, and the caregiver gave a grateful nod. It was a quiet farewell, but it carried the weight of profound gratitude and relief. The man had intervened at precisely the right time, providing calm guidance and protection that had prevented potential tragedy. Driving away, he reflected on the nature of human connection. Sometimes, he thought, people underestimate the power of simply noticing, stepping in, and offering calm guidance. Small actions, quiet patience, and attentiveness could change the course of events, saving lives in the most unexpected ways. That afternoon had been proof of that truth. The child, now safely returned to his caregiver, continued to process the events. Though he was too young to understand fully, he felt the warmth of safety, the comfort of trust, and the reassurance that someone cared deeply about his well-being. The lessons learned in such moments, patience, trust, and the importance of calm guidance, would stay with him in subtle but lasting ways. By the time evening settled over the highway, the scene had quieted. Life moved on around Boulder Highway, the cars, the traffic, the ordinary hum of daily routines, but for the small family, the impact of the day was profound. They had experienced fear, relief, and gratitude all within a short span, and they would carry the memory of the man who had helped their child forever. The man, driving away, thought about the simplicity and purity of human kindness. He hadn't sought recognition or reward. He had acted because it was the right thing to do. Yet the effect of that simple choice had rippled outward, saving a child, reassuring a caregiver, and inspiring those who had witnessed it. It was a reminder that quiet heroism exists all around us, often unnoticed but deeply meaningful. Back at the apartment complex, the caregiver settled her child into a safe, familiar space. She hugged him tightly, reassuring him once again that he was safe. She spoke softly about what had happened, explaining that he had been brave and that help had arrived just in time. The child listened, absorbing the words and the calm reassurance, feeling the security of home and the enduring presence of those who cared. Neighbors, who had observed the scene, reflected quietly on what they had witnessed. A sense of awe lingered in the air. They had seen danger averted through simple attention and human care. They had seen a man act selflessly, remaining calm, patient, and focused on the well-being of a small child. It was a story that would stay with them, a reminder that even in busy, distracted lives, human kindness can shine through and make a real difference. As the night fell, Boulder Highway returned to its usual rhythm, but the day's events remained etched in the memories of everyone involved. The child had been lost, confused, and frightened, but through careful guidance, calm intervention, and human care, he had been returned safely to his caregiver. The man's quiet actions had created a ripple effect, ensuring safety, reassurance, and hope in a moment when it mattered most. In the end, the story on Boulder Highway was not just about a lost child found. It was about the quiet, unnoticed acts of courage and care that make the world a better place. It was about calm presence in moments of fear, about human connection in the face of uncertainty, and about the profound impact one person can have on the life of another. And though the man drove away quietly, unseen and uncelebrated, the child, the caregiver, and everyone who had witnessed the events carried the story in their hearts. It was a day that began with fear but ended in relief, gratitude, and hope, a testament to the power of attention, care, and quiet heroism in everyday life.